Max Factor was a real person, and that was his real name too. In fact, though most people don't seem to know it today, he was one of the greatest innovators of makeup that the world has ever known. From humble beginnings, he was almost forced to be the highest paid makeup artist in all of Russia before he escaped to America, where he would influence not only Western cosmetics, but literally the world, inventing, or at least popularizing, platinum blonde hair, inventing the lip gloss, even popularizing the term makeup entirely. His influence is completely unmatched, and his legacy is lasting. This video is informed by these books. Links will be below, but more importantly, the reference will be on the top left corner as usual, where appropriate. The exact year of Maksymillian Faktorowicz's birth is truly unknown. Many dates are assumed from 1872, 1874, and according to the books, on the 17th of September 1877. Though supposedly, Max himself was not even aware of exactly when he was born. Nevertheless, he was born to parents Abraham and Cecilia Tandowski Factor as one of 10 children, something common at the time as infant mortality was at around a quarter of all of deaths in Russia, requiring families to be larger to survive. However, in Max's case, their trouble was quite the opposite, as mostly the parents were absent from their children's lives. Their mother had actually died while Max was still a toddler. The internet seems to believe it was due to cholera in 1874, but according to the books, he wouldn't have been born then, so we assume a later date. It's a little bit unknown. While his father was just a textile mill worker who worked excruciatingly long hours, and therefore, it was enough to prevent him from being home to see them on a regular basis, causing Max to be raised by his older siblings in their hometown of Zdunska Wola near Wola, which today is in Poland, but was then part of the partitioned territory belonging to Russia. Thank you very much to this comment on my video, The Rise and Fall of Max Factor, for helping me pronounce these place names. So, as you can tell, there is extremely little information on his very early years. However, we do know that he was an incredibly visual and artistic young boy from this very early age. We also know that of the little education that the boy received, it would have been from his enrollment in Hebrew school. Thanks to an exceptionally detailed book called the Zdunska Wola book, which is available in English online, I'll link it below, we know that he would have studied in both English and Polish. It's also unlikely that he would have worn traditional Jewish garb because despite building the town, there was a lot of pushback against the religion from Christians who had moved in and who run the government, and that the school would have been inside the synagogue in a room called the Cheder, which meant that it was a single-room educational facility for those of primary school age. However, with that said, while he was supposed to be studying, he really couldn't afford to, and instead he largely abandoned his education in order to go to work to help his particularly poor family financially. This would end up having really large ramifications on his life because he never ended up learning to speak English, which was one of the primary languages within the school. In fact, Max had likely begun work at 7 years old, beginning employed life selling fruit, specifically oranges, peanuts, and sweets, inside the lobby of the Tsarina Theatre in their closest city of Wola, which for context was a theatrical theatre, as in actors on stage, not a cinema theatre, as those did not exist yet. It was here that he was first exposed to the performing arts, however, and it had a profound impact on the boy, all of which books seem to quote him saying some variation of the quote, "It was my introduction to the world of make-believe." But in reality, he actually didn't work here for very long, as by the age of 8, he'd already started working as an assistant to a local apothecary, where he would supply medicines via remedies, potions, and pills, as well as provide dental care, which he quite enjoyed the gory side of. But by 9, in fact soon after his 9th birthday, his employment changed again, this time back to the performing arts, as he became an apprentice to a company called Wola. Wola were the premier wig maker and cosmetician, the term makeup artist did not yet exist, company in the area, and though I couldn't find any extra information on the company outside of their connection to Maksymillian Faktorowitz, it was here that he would finally find long-term work, as the company would house the young talent for 4 years. This would prove to be an exceptionally valuable learning experience, as it was here that he learned the art of applying stage makeup, which was much more difficult than it sounds 100 years ago, and how to ventilate wigs, which is the act of tying individual hair fibers into lace to make the hairline look natural. While he was talented and enjoyed both, it was actually specifically in his wig making that he showed significant early talent, and it soon had him noticed by Anton of Berlin. Anton of Berlin seemed to be almost like a talent agency who would hire cosmeticians and wig makers on a roaming basis to follow their clients around to various cities and countries, filling employment gaps. This, for Faktor, meant that he was assigned at the age of 14 to work in Moscow with one of their premier clients, Corpo, making wigs and doing the makeup to the Imperial Grand Opera, including their performances to the royal family of Russia. This was a real test of talent for the young teen, as at this point in Russian history, even off-stage, extravagant wigs were a must for the elites of Russia, becoming a defining fashion feature of the period. And Max was good, very good at making wigs, almost always finding praise at the end of a performance where Max, quiet and calm as ever, would nearly always be met backstage with a rush of admirers trying to meet the boy behind the looks. However, despite his usually positive reception and very clear talent, he wasn't exactly always treated justly by the company. Because of his age, he ended up being the one to blame for anything and everything that went wrong. To quote this book, "If the tenor missed his cue, Max's makeup was to blame. If the diva's performance was off, perhaps her eyebrows hadn't been arched to her liking. If the conductor misplaced his score, it was because Max had kept him waiting." As the months wore on, Max was saddled with even more responsibilities. Hairdresser, prop boy, ballet, gopher, his easygoing nature was often tested to the extreme. Fortunately, Max had an incredible patience and an even better work ethic, and so his time learning from and working with the top performers in Russia only actually came to an end when at 18, so 4 years after the apprenticeship had begun, he was obliged to conduct a mandatory 4-year stint in the Russian military. This ended up being another unique learning experience. It was during this time in the military that Max became a trained nurse. He actually requested to do his service as part of the theatre, but they did not honor this request, and so he just fully trained as a nurse, doing whatever the doctor would ask of him. In retrospect, he did say later in life that unfortunately it wasn't a job that he liked very much, but he still respected his time there really greatly because he ended up learning a lot, like how to bleed patients with cups and leeches, and all about phrenology and skin disorders, which actually would come in handy very much later in his career when his theatrical line of cosmetics were some of, if not the, least toxic on the market. However, something did change during his time in the military, and that was his family. During this 4-year military stint, his father finally remarried following the death of Max's mother, who had died when he was a toddler, and together they also had a total of 10 children, according to a couple of censuses in the US, including one from 1910. 2 of which died in childbirth, but the remaining were named Bernard, Nathan, Gussie, Frank, Beenham, Dina, and Yankel, with their youngest son being John Jacob Faktor, meaning Max was now one of at least 20 children. Naturally, considering how overcrowded his family home would have been, he did not want to return to his hometown when his service came to an end when he was 22, and instead, he established himself in a small town outside Moscow called Razan, where he would use his saved money from Corpo to buy his own theatrical goods store. This book calls it a costume shop, so I assume they also sold costumes, along with making and selling his own creams, rouges, fragrances, and wigs, which the other book says that he was definitely formulating and selling in this store at this time. However, I actually had a friend of mine translate this picture, and apparently the signs read very much like a unisex hair cutting salon. She said it's a bit hard to tell because it's blurry, but it's definitely a hairdressing salon, and the services they provide are barbershop, haircuts, and hairstyling at the very least. Culturally at this time, it would have been far more common for men to cut their hair regularly, as women wore their hair up at this time with hats or wigs. But she said that the words used in the signs are universal, ungendered, and that it's not explicitly a barbershop indicating male clientele, which, though she does reiterate is hard to be sure, I personally do think is likely, knowing that he was selling theatrical makeup in the store as well, and he was probably doing all of these services for wigs also. In any regard, it actually was a great success already by the time he was 22. And he did love his shop. For the first time in his life, he was out from under the thumb of another. He wasn't living some lavish life in a successful shop, but he was certainly better off than the life he knew in childhood. And he was certainly better off than when he was getting blamed for everything working for Corpo. Basically, he was finally happy. But of course, good things do often come to an end, and this happy time that he had with his shop would also soon change after a traveling performance group decided to pass through his shop on their way to their next show just so they could restock on makeup and wigs. Now, Max did not know who they were headed to perform for. At least that was until, unfortunately, this visit would have a domino effect on his business. You see, that performing group went to perform in front of the imperial court. And after they saw the hair and the makeup, the court began shopping at his store themselves for their own wigs. Not the makeup though, makeup was actually largely frowned upon at this point in history, so that was mostly just for theatre performers. But the wig shopping itself, domino continued, and after getting the attention of the court, saw Max was forced into a position as the official cosmetician for wigs and makeup for Alexander Nikolaevich Romanov, uncle to Tsar Nicholas II, the Tsar's personal physician, and the Imperial Russian Grand Opera once again. He hated this, but he had no choice. Whatever Tsar Nicholas II wanted, Tsar Nicholas II got, and that included Max Factor's freedom. Quote, he'd be forever on call, at the whim of the court favourites who wanted him to attend their beautification, to create a new hairstyle or to correct cosmetic problems so that their eyes might sparkle, cheeks glow and hair gleam when the Tsar of all of Russia looked upon them. All of my attention went to their individual needs by showing them how to enhance their good points and conceal the less good, Max recalled later. Really, the only few good things to come from this was firstly that he was paid extremely handsomely for his services, likely becoming the best paid cosmetician in all of Russia. Secondly, that he wanted for nothing. He was surrounded by jewels, beautiful fabrics, and home decor, all of which anything he could possibly want was just provided to him. Though I'm sure they stopped short of the jewels. I can't imagine he got too many of those. And thirdly, he was able to keep his shop. Something rather unusual, so it seems. This, though, ended up being really the saving grace to his time in the court, as basically it provided him an excuse to get out of the palace. It was gorgeous, sure, but the palace was a gilded prison, and he longed for nothing more than his few permitted hours a week to visit his beloved store in Ryazan. Of course, these visits were strictly on a business basis. He could only restock his supply to make beautiful the court and to check that the store was running okay without him. These visits, in fact, were even guarded each and every time, like he was on parole from said gilded prison. But he kept it up. Fearful that he had no alternative, he just kept the peace with the court and with the guards. However, that built trust was soon tested after one particular trip to his store. On this day, he'd met a notably thin, dark-eyed young woman from Moscow out on a shopping trip with her chaperone. As she perused his wares, Max became enchanted, answering all of her questions on his powders and his creams and his perfumes and his rouge, which upon leading her to the window to try it out in the daylight, i.e. get away from the prying ears of the chaperone, they were able to talk. She introduced herself as Esther Rosa, and she had been taken to him just as he had been enchanted by her. She wanted to see him again. But with the Tsar being as possessive as he was, there was literally a rule to forbid anybody in court marrying or even dating without express permission, by the way. They had to meet surreptitiously. She would return at a pre-designated time. However, unlike Max walking through the front door on business, she would be able to sneak through the back door, which luckily connected to her friend's house who was living next door. So this is how they met up. An hour here, an hour there, never too long, but they fell head over heels in love. It wasn't long before Lizzie, which was Max's nickname for Esther Rosa, found a rabbi who was willing to marry the two without a license, which was very important because no license meant no paperwork, and no paperwork meant less, but not no, risk. The following week, Lizzie and the priest were already waiting for the secret fiancé when he walked through the door. They married in whispers, and after the priest made his tactile exit, consummated the marriage there and then. Leaving her that day, Lizzie cried happy tears, and though they couldn't be physically together, they were devoted to one another, even when kept apart. However, soon their visits would reduce, as both Max's work events became even more demanding than they already were, as he became more in demand naturally, but also because Lizzie fell pregnant. They had 3 secret children in total. First came Frida, born January 22nd, 1898, Cecilia, born October 17th, 1899, and Davis, born February 2nd, 1902. All of whom were almost never able to see their father at these young ages because it was just too risky. Max hated missing them growing up, but really, they literally had no choice. They could not meet elsewhere because of the guards, and it was too risky to bring the children to the shop as well because of the guards. Neither parent liked the arrangement. Max himself, having known how hard raising children was for his single dad, had enormous empathy for Lizzie. But there was seemingly nothing he could do. At least, that was while they were safe. They were distant, but they were safe. You see, unfortunately, Tsar Nicholas II was anti-Semitic, and you may remember that both Max and his new bride, and all of their children, were Jewish, and this was soon to be a very big problem. Now, I had to Google this, but Wikipedia says there's literally no real reason for his anti-Semitism, except perhaps paranoia and a hereditarily taught prejudice, which Wikipedia dates back to about 100 years before, when they split Poland to Austria, Prussia, and Russia, inheriting the Jewish population into Russia. This was the country's first time with a large Jewish population, and so fear of the unknown, being fear of the unknown, it supposedly caused a paranoia in the royal family, which was passed down to Tsar Nicholas II, who, quote, feared a rise in Jewish power. If the Jews became stronger, he believed they would overthrow the government. So, although the royal family lived in seclusion, constantly protected by secret police and military guards, he felt his life, or his way of life, was threatened. This ended up in a situation where now, at only 26 years old, Max found himself in the middle of a siege on Jewish folk living in Russia, which, though he was safe because of his job and how loved he was by the court, meant that his wife and his children were not. Little by little, Tsar Nicholas II ordered the arson of Jewish villages and as such the mass displacement of the minority community. Max's brother Nathan fled to St. Louis in America, followed by his uncle Fischl soon after, as they had heard that the World Fair that would have taken place in the coming year of 1903 had been delayed to 1904. This was his chance. Max knew if he could get a spot in the World Fair, that he could sell his cosmetics and effectively transfer his beloved shop in Russia over to America. But how to escape the court, and how to take his family with him. Quote, overworked and under pressure from constant surveillance, Max began to lose weight. He'd always been of small stature, barely 5 feet tall, and slight build. Most of the court didn't notice, they only saw themselves. Max had made a good friend at court, a general whom he felt he could trust. Rarely in Moscow, the general had returned from the field to see the beautician looking poorly and troubled. He invited Max to speak with him privately, away from the guards. Max finally shared his dangerous secret about the girl he loved, the clandestine marriage, his young children, and his dream of America. The general listened quietly, then told Max it would be arranged. The following day at the court, the general remarked that the cosmetician looked ill, and what a catastrophe it would be for the courtiers, what with the coming season of grand pageants and balls hosted by the Tsar at the palace. Immediately the next morning, he was seen by the general's personal physician, who, because Max had doused himself in yellowish makeup to fake jaundice, was prescribed a stay of 90 days in Carlsbad, which was effectively a luxury natural spring or spa that members of the court frequented when they were too sick. But Max wasn't going to go. As soon as the doctor left, the kindly general explained his real plan. Max was to be taken to Carlsbad by guards, limp into the facility to fool the guards into thinking he was safe, then, without clocking in, run to the nearby town centre where his wife would be waiting with his children, all arranged by the general, of course, and they together would run through the nearby forest, walking through the nighttime snowy terrain before they reached the Malka III, a cruise ship ready to take them to America. And you know what? It went off without a hitch. The palace realized far too late to stop them. Passports didn't exist then, so that didn't slow them down. Lizzie had taken as much as she could carry from his Razan store, and he managed to carry $40,000 in his pocket, which in 2024 is just over $1.4 million in his pocket to set themselves up for a new life. They even had first-class tickets on the boat, no less. The Malka III left for the States on the 13th of February 1904, and the family were finally safe from Russian persecution. Of course, they didn't feel safe at first. They spent many nights withdrawn to their cabin for fear that a Russian person had followed them on board and was waiting to find them and bring them back. But of course, when they did eventually decide to join the other passengers, they realized that they had nothing to worry about and even began making friends on the ship. Specifically, they made friends with this one young chap who unfortunately does go unnamed in all of the sources, but would become rather close to the family. The man was fluent in Polish, English, Russian, and German, so was able to communicate with the Faktors nice and easily, unlike the many Americans on board with whom Max had no common language, which, for reference, Max spoke Polish, Russian, and even German, which he had picked up at Anton of Berlin, but he did not speak English, for he had never had a need for it. In fact, the trip proved to be more than just a linguistic eye-opener for the family, as there were hordes of people on board. The rich, the poor, well-dressed and otherwise. This ended up being their view into the vastness of the human race. But the man that he clicked with was that one polyglot who also happened to be in first class. Max would confide into him just how nervous he was about language and how he worried that it would hold him back from making the most of the upcoming World's Fair, to which surprisingly, the man offered to help. He would translate for Max, even help fund the concession, and they could share in the profits together. Max just couldn't believe his luck. This was a new country with a new friend and a new business partner. All of the things that he would need were solving themselves before his very eyes. Max was on top of the world. They sailed past the Statue of Liberty, docked in New York Harbor, and his American dream was sure to come true. But there were a few hiccups. Firstly, not knowing enough English to explain his predicament, Faktor had accidentally renamed his entire family to Factor, spelled with a C, on immigration, just because of a spelling mistake. And then also, Faktor didn't seem to like New York all that much. Quote, "A terrible place of crowds and noise. A frightening place where hordes charged up and down at furious pace, jabbering in an unknown tongue." Honestly, I would personally just imagine it was very intimidating for him. Imagine going from another country, forced to leave your home for fear of persecution, only to then not be able to communicate with anybody at all, and having 4 people dependent on you. I can only imagine how stressful it must have been. Nonetheless, the group of, well, this book says 5, but I could count 6, including the business partner, grabbed a horse-drawn trolley and took a trip down to Grand Central Station. Now this he liked. The huge space, the vast amount of people walking through the fog, it was the kind of buzz that he had always imagined of America. Here they boarded the train to St. Louis, where his brother, uncle, and the World Fair were going to be, and they arrived sometime around March 1904. But when they got there, because the fair had been delayed a year, because it was their 100th year celebration, and because he arrived mere weeks before the opening day, obviously nothing was available in or even near the central areas. Instead, he spent almost all the money he had brought with him from Russia on a small space away from the main footfall in the Palace of Varied Industries and Manufacture. The fair itself was colossal in scale, in attendance, in booths, and in the fact that it was 1,200 acres wide. Though the discrepancy between the footfall of the main areas and his little corner was ridiculous. With that said, he was still happy that he got a space at all at the event of the century, and even more elated when he realized his covert location would offer him some protection from the over 600 Russians that were supposed to be at the fair. He didn't know them, nor their loyalties, and that was scary. Nothing happened, mind. In fact, the Russian government had decided not to take part in the fair entirely, meaning that the people in attendance were there of their own volition, totally unconnected to the Russian government who he believed were searching for him, so safer than he imagined. Actually, they ended up being performers, in fact, so it was even his target market. In the end, the festival really went well, very swimmingly. Max took only one day off the entire time. He took the 18th of August, where he attended the birth of his fourth child, Frank, and the two partners took more money than they could have ever expected. So, though exhausted from the 10 6-day weeks with barely a break, Max Factor could now successfully say that there was a market here for his same cosmetics, perfumes, combs, and hair products that had once supplied the royals of Russia. At least, that was until the final day, when upon arriving at the festival after 10 weeks of solid work, he came across his store newly bare, stripped of all of its goods and all of the money that the pair had made. He'd been robbed. He'd been robbed by his associate. He could have been hysterical, both in anger and in sadness, but incredibly, Max seemed to stay in rather good spirits. Instead of moping, he found value in what he had achieved and what he had learned thanks to the unnamed man translating basically everything. Thanks to him, he learned that his products could be successful here, just as he had dreamed. So he wasn't angry at the man, but instead, if anything, it ended up giving him a massive ego boost. His confidence in his products was correctly rather high following this. Quote, he knew he was a master cosmetician and could style and cut hair to perfection. The only problem with this is that because he lacked the knowledge of the land and obviously lacked the English skills needed, he didn't really know where to go from here. The regular public really wasn't wearing makeup in the way they do now. In fact, it was still rather taboo. Women pinched their cheeks for rouging effect and bit their lips to make them redder, but makeup still was not a term used in polite society. And secondly, it really wasn't available in the more natural iterations we have now. Back then, makeup was pretty solidly either for prostitutes or for on-stage performers. It was about 1/8 of an inch thick, if you can imagine that, and layered like a mask on the skin, by which I mean it cracked and actually aged the wearer significantly when not at a distance, in a dark room, under stag lights. So there really wasn't anywhere he knew he could sell this very specific product. There was interest, but where? Unfortunately, because of the robbery, he really didn't have the time to find it either. He now had 5 dependents, a wife and 4 children to support, with newly heavily reduced funds because of the swindler. So, with financial help from his uncle and his brother who were still in the area, at 1513 Biddle Street, St. Louis, Max bought a house for his family. On the first floor, second floor to Americans, they would live, and below he would open his own men's barbershop, where he would cut hair, shampoo, trim nose hair, and offer shaves as well. Men, of course, here being chosen because they needed weekly beard care, whereas women seldom visited the hair salon, particularly due to long hair being the style du jour. As it was, his men's barbershop ended up being quite successful too, not really because of his talent, but because his store was the best equipped with plumbing. Indoor plumbing still at this time was a great luxury, even in residential homes, so this was quite the draw. Men could have a wash, a bathe is the word used in this book, before they had their haircut service for 25 cents. The only issue with this was, it wasn't really Max's true passion. It did well, so he stayed. He just didn't love it. He never did. The rest of the family presumably were more than happy though. Away from persecution, a provider with a lucrative business, and 2 loving parents, they could want for nothing more. At least that was until the 17th of March 1906, only 2 years after moving to America, when Lizzie collapsed to an immediate death while walking just a short distance from her home. She'd had a brain hemorrhage and died just on the spot, leaving Max with 4 children that still barely knew him. It was a horrendous tragedy for the whole family, and Max was desperate for childcare. He loved his wife, obviously, but it seemed her death put into perspective just how much she had done for him, and he just couldn't manage on his own. So he wrote to family in Russia, the Strakauskas, who he knew had several daughters. Now, this wasn't ideal. Even though she was the eldest daughter, he felt that she was still merely a child herself, having only recently turned of age. But he was kind of desperate. He literally couldn't marry an American wife because he still didn't really speak English. He would in fact never speak English fully throughout his entire life. He learnt bits and bobs here and there, but especially at this point, he had nowhere near the level of English needed in order for him to actually court a wife in this time period. So he needed to look to Russia. Their acceptance of his marital offer letter was accepted within a month, and they ended up being married by the 15th of August that same year, only 5 months after the death of Lizzie. Huma, or Helen as he nicknamed her, Max had obviously known in childhood, but he didn't really know much about her. He knew she was creative, that she enjoyed sewing, specifically sewing for her doll collection, and that she had worked as a tutor, but that's literally all he knew of her before her marriage. However, while this was not a marriage of love, instead a marriage of pure necessity, it ended up being far worse than he could have ever imagined. The first year was fine enough. They had their first child, Max's 5th, a child named Louis, on August 29, 1907, but it was soon after this that things went south. Most sources claim Helen hated children and was affected by it. This is evidenced in books as to how she was outspoken in her irritation over the needs of a then baby, Louis, who she soon stopped caring for. This then bled out to Max's 4 other children who, though less demanding than a baby, she was still societally expected to care for and who she soon stopped caring for as well. As a result, Max was forced to take over the parental role in the house, most often taking the baby Louis and young Frank to work with him and hiring 2 shop assistants trained in barbering to take over the workload to afford him time for his children. All of which sounds expected now, of course, but in 1907, this was not a time when women could easily work, and it was not a time when men were expected to look after the children either. So in a way, they were quite lucky that the barbershop made enough passive income to support neither parent actively working in the business, though it is well pointed out that the older children, Frida, Cecilia and Davis, were helpful too, both before and after school. However, Helen's condition just continued to worsen as she began directing her discomfort not only to the children, but to Max as well. For forcing her to leave Russia, for forcing her to leave her friends, her family, the boyfriend that she had actually loved, all to come to a country so vastly different, a place where she was expected to be happy about having to give up everything that she knew. She began to retaliate, embarrassing him in front of customers in the barbershop, refusing to do housework, hitting him, verbally abusing him. She stole jewelry from the children, pawning them for money, and she'd run away from home to the tune of days on end. Max even expected that she was just cheating with other men because he knew she was going on nights out, but would refuse to explain anything more than that. The marriage was extremely hard on everyone involved, and eventually Max had to file for divorce. But, quote, Helen bitterly fought back with slanderous accusations. Court records on file in St. Louis show that she claimed Max was not the father of Louis, which was proven to be false. Following a nasty year-long court battle, Max was awarded custody of his 5 children. Obviously, this was a very stressful time for Max, but incredibly, his family drama was yet to finish. Sometime after the divorce, his half-brother John Jacob Factor, who you may remember was born during Max's military service, showed up at his doorstep. But Max didn't know him. He was born after Max had left. Frankly, he was the last person Max would have expected to see at the door. Nevertheless, he was family, and Max did have a skill-based business which could be taught. So he took John Jacob in, teaching him everything he knew about cosmetology. His kindness in this was noted around town. I'm sure they sympathized with the conditions of his previous marriage, and soon a kind neighbor began helping him around the house and with the children to allow him the time to train John Jacob. And actually, John Jacob ended up like a fish to water. He learned quickly, he tried to get customers in and out quickly to improve footfall, and even upsold extras like having a splash of bay rum to run up their tab and make more money for the business. But then, out of the blue, John Jacob announced that he was going out on his own, opening a second Factor family barbershop within walking distance of the original. They never spoke again, but actually this time would give John Jacob his nickname, Jake the Barber Factor, which would haunt him throughout his career as one of the most successful con men in all of history, stealing millions both from the UK and America, and that's millions in 1920s money, not in today's money. It was an astronomical amount stolen. In any case, the only constant in all of Max's life was Jenny Cook, the kindly neighbor who had offered to help look after his children while he was training John Jacob. They entered into a romantic relationship and ended up marrying on the 21st of January 1908, less than half a year from his second divorce. But it ended up being one of the best decisions of his life. Finally, romantically happy, Jenny was very supportive of her husband's disinterest in barbering. Instead, she saw value in one of Max's main hobbies. You see, starting back in 1904, Max had been learning about photoplays, which were an early iteration of what would become movies, just from the men that frequented his shop who would tell him all the stories about them, and he quickly became interested. He went to watch photoplays, spending a nickel to watch the great train Robbery from 1904, which was all the rage at the time. Literally, it was just a folding chair in a dark room with a projector and about 20 other people, but Max was entranced, obsessed even, for the next 4 years of his life. He learned that all photoplays were made in New York, New Jersey, or Chicago, and he once longed to go there. But now, in 1908, they were moving to much cheaper planes. Los Angeles. At this time, LA was nothing like it is now. It was mostly farmland, in fact. It was fruit trees and orange groves, not much more. Groundwork had been laid for what was to come, but it hadn't really been fleshed out just yet. And frankly, the movie business was still very fresh to the area, with the first picture being shot there by the Selig company titled The Count of Monte Cristo and only released in 1907, so just months before his January 1908 marriage. But he couldn't get it out of his head. He wanted to follow the buzz, interested to know if he could reprise his theatrical makeup and wigs for use on screen. So, in the same year he married Jenny Cook, they set off with Max's 5 children to the West Coast to make a new life for themselves. All leading to October 11, 1908, when Max Factor opened Max Factor's antiseptic hair store on 1204 South Central Avenue, the birth of a business that was soon to change the world, though officially being founded on the 2nd of January 1909 as Max Factor & Company. Now I know you know, but I have already got a video specifically on the rise and fall of Max Factor as a company already, so I'll keep this video focused on Max the person as much as possible. But the man and his work were intrinsically linked from here on, because he was just so proud of his cosmetics, his wigs, and the family that he had curated. Obviously, the business boomed here, and he could really provide the life he wanted for his family. Performers quickly became patrons of his store, partially because he stocked popular brands like Leichner and Miner, partially because he had his own line of products, and partially because it was just so close to the production studios. Within the year, Max Factor's was the place to go for performers of all kinds coming in or out of the area. By 1910, Max Factor was doing well personally, he was back to being well established, and finally back to his foundation, pun intended, of experimenting with cosmetic chemistry in a lab in the back of the shop. He was finally happy again. This was when a bigger boom of film projects began to happen in the area, and it began to become more commonplace to see one-reelers, which were 12-minute long films being filmed just out on the street. It's exactly this that in 1910, Max Factor spotted just outside his store. He remembered them looking quite terrible, and so he followed them down the street to ask what they were wearing. And it was all just household products of their own concoctions. You see, the only theatrical makeup available at the time was stage makeup, and the grease paint was simply too thick for film work. It cracked, it aged the performers, it was uncomfortable at that mask 1/8 of an inch level. So while good for the stage, it just looked atrocious in real life and on film. Max could do better, and he knew it. So he took to his laboratory, working day and night on his take for on-camera grease paint, often becoming so obsessed that his wife and children were left alone to attend the shop. In the meantime, he became an American citizen in 1912. He began renting wigs to studios, very successfully I might add. His children grew up to also be very interested in the family business and were happy to be taught all of the tricks and the trades and the crafts, all from ventilating a wig to creating theatrical grease paint for themselves. Davis and Frank, as children, even tried to sell their own mustaches and beards to the public for festive costume-necessary events like Halloween. Actually, they even hired some school friends to help them do it, which, bearing in mind they were between 6 and 12 years old at this time, was quite a feat. So much so that their father had to step in and stop them undercutting the prices of his own wigs in his store, which were awfully similar in quality. According to Davis, quote, he discovered that a few of the older boys were charging only 15 cents, a fortune to them, but not to father. So instead, to not drain their entrepreneurial spirit, the school friends found work at Max Factor's shop as well, should he need the help. Finally, though, after many substandard samples, in 1914, he finally formulated the perfect grease paint for the silver screen. A cream produced in 12 shades that was more flexible and significantly thinner in consistency than ever before, but most importantly, that would not cause cracks when worn for long periods of time. It was an enormous success and immediately became the standard for the whole cinema industry, making him, naturally, a fortune. The business grew to larger premises in the Pantage building in downtown LA, and queues were round the block every morning, full of famous performers of all kinds waiting to be made up by Mr. Factor himself. Of course, this was still in the days where actors did their own makeup, or at least were responsible for their own makeup, but soon whole studios would just send new stars to be totally made over and basically invented by Max Factor. The one that came up a lot in the comments of the previous video was, of course, Lucille Ball, whose hair color, that kind of buttery red tone, was invented and specifically made for her by Max Factor, although that happened a few years later. Anyway, at this time, Max was finally in his element. He had a string of loyal customers, including the studios, a demand in Hollywood unmatched by another. A new child named Sydney was born on February 14th, 1916, and he was even becoming the go-to person for when new things needed to be developed that had really nothing to do with cosmetics, such as developing a cream pie for the cream pie gag that firstly wouldn't go off, but mostly would stick to the actor's face a bit better for a prolonged gag. Before long, to improve the size of the store moved again to 326 South Hill Street, and quickly Max Factor became so popular with actors and so known in the eyes of the public that he would be able to release his own line of public-facing makeup directly. He was already famous from the movies, so this was just the next natural step. The line was then controversially called Society Makeup, and pretty much single-handedly, over time, erased the stigma that the word makeup then held, which before this, the predominant word would have been cosmetics, just FYI. It also wasn't long before his public-facing line was also one of the top in the industry, while his theatrical line of makeup quickly became the #1 brand on the market, outselling both Leichner and Miner combined. He was even able to flog seemingly random other products that he had invented quite well, including his headlight shampoo named Kill 'em Quick. By 1922, the family was truly rich beyond their wildest dreams, And yet, despite this, every time the business had moved, the family was relegated to a small space that was nearby enough so that Max could just work longer and longer hours. It served them so well, but now it was time for him to really feel the rewards of his work and settle down in a real house. They had their eyes set on Boyle Heights in East LA, where there was already a growing Jewish population with whom they would have so much in common. It was also still quite near to the store, and there was a nice 2-story, 3,100 square foot home there going for a good price on a nice, quiet street. Craftsman in style and built in 1907, the house had 4 large bedrooms, separate dining room, maid's room, laundry chute, 2 east-facing solariums, one on each floor, with rich wood paneling throughout, and a large garage where he had set up a small home lab. Here, Max just kept experimenting, inventing products like his panchromatic makeup for Technicolor film, the first lip gloss, a skin brightener, which was supposedly a precursor to primers, and many more inventions, including this monstrosity that's meant to measure one's perfect facial proportions. He had reached heights of success achieved by an extremely limited few. And by 1928, he was presented with a special certificate by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which I think is now known as the Academy Awards, for his work on panchromatic makeup and other such innovations. He later told his son Frank that this was the happiest day of his life. The same year, they opened the new Max Factor building, and literally the business just could not have been in a better place. Even the stock market crash of October 1929 that caused the Great Depression could not slow them down. But they had always remained rather humble regardless. In, I believe, 1932 or 1934-ish, after a brief stint in a duplex on Mansfield Avenue in Hollywood, occupied because it was just closer to the store, the family was finally moved once again to 802 North Elm Drive in Beverly Hills, then called Beverly Gardens, I believe, into a 2-story place just so that he was near his now married and moved out children. The place itself was quite sizable. It was in a then up-and-coming area, lavishly decorated, even with an era-appropriate spiral staircase. However, he would never really be able to relish in this new place, as in 1936, Max Factor was hit by a delivery truck after stepping off a curb, I suppose without looking. Now, this did not kill him. He did not die in this accident. But it's speculation from this book, but they claim that, quote, the accident is largely thought to have contributed to his health decline due to infection or other complications that would come to affect him for the rest of his life. But from the phrasing of it, it seems that it may not have been known at the time, because in 1938, Max and Davis ended up leaving for a business trip in Italy, supposedly in high spirits. They were having a wonderful time, father and son hanging out together in Europe, a place that we know that they both enjoyed. However, it's en route to Italy while in Paris that they received a not-so-friendly letter. $200 in exchange for Max Factor's life. Max was being blackmailed in a foreign country by an unknown entity. Naturally, Max was terrified. He had been instructed to drop the money off alone by the Eiffel Tower and no harm would come to him if he followed the rules. But he could not stop the anxiety. He also didn't follow the rules. Instead, he contacted the police, which was probably for the best, and they called the gendarme and hired a stand-in lookalike to do the trade. Quote, a man of Max's size arrived at the hotel where Max and Davis were staying. He was given a mustache, grey hair, glasses, and Max's overcoat and hat. Then he left for the Eiffel Tower to meet the extortionist at the appointed time. French police in plain clothes were nearby. The decoy waited and waited, but no one in the milling crowd of sightseers approached him. An hour later, he returned to the hotel with the money and reported the uneventful happening. So the assumed killer was still out there. Max had broken the rules. Did they know? Was it someone who knew exactly what Max looked like? Max was terrified, visibly disturbed. The doctor was called and they were advised to cut the journey short so that he could have time to work through the anxiety in the comfort of his own home. But his fear did not absolve. Cruising back to the US, he arrived home at the end of August 1938, laid on his bed, and died on the 30th of August 1938 at the probable age of 61. Now, the books don't give an exact cause of death, other than suggesting quite heavily that it was from stress and anxiety following the blackmailing, while the Museum of Jewish People attribute his cause of death to a heart attack. In any regards, seemingly it was clear that the end was closing in for the man. He likely looked very close to death at the time of his passing. Of course, they would have known about the car crash, but because this wasn't thought to have contributed to his state until much later, mostly this was evidenced at the time by the sheer amount of people by his bedside when he passed. There was his wife Jenny, his daughters Frida and Cecilia, and sons Davis, Frank, Louis, and Sidney. They were all present at the passing of their family member, showing just how loved he was as well. His death was reported on very widely by newspapers around the world, in many places as front-page news. He was a beloved man who created the faces of so many women in the industry. Joan, Crawford, Lucille Ball, and even the many characters of The Wizard of Oz, who all owed their looks to this man that never once stopped innovating in cosmetics throughout his life. His funeral was held on Groman Mortuary with the wake interment held at Hillside Memorial Park in LA. To quote his son Frank at his funeral, quote, "He hadn't set out to alter the general grooming habits of women around the world, but it happened incidentally. By creating makeup materials and techniques for use in cinema, he was one of the rarest individuals who had lived to see literally all of his dreams, plans, ambitions, and creative thoughts come to full fruition." Thank you very much for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe for more just like this. For videos like this, but about fashion, do check out my fashion channel Understitch here, and a special thank you, of course, goes out to my patrons over on Patreon for their ongoing support. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.